welcome to the latest edition of my podcast Thingamajig here on Substack. The guest is Jesse Singal. Many of you are probably familiar with him, but he is a journalist. He's the co-host of the Blocked and Reported podcast and also an all-around swell guy, notwithstanding the bizarrely intense online vitriol he often provokes. He has a book out this week called The Quick Fix: Why Fad Psychology Can't Cure Our Social Ills. And I recommend you buy the book. There is a link to do so in this Substack post. Also, subscribe to this podcast on all the standard places you subscribe to podcasts. Subscribe to the YouTube channel where you can get a video version of this podcast. And subscribe to the Substack itself. That is supremely important. All right, let's get into it. All right, hello, Jesse.
Hey, how's it going, man?
Doing okay. So, you have a book out, and just for the audience, if I have some background noise that appears in your ears at any time, not a whole lot I can do about that, living on a noisy thoroughfare.
How dare you? I'm deeply offended.
I know. I mean, if I were rolling in as much dough as I'm accused of rolling in, maybe I could afford a more sound.
You have the city block off the street whenever you record your podcast.
Right.
Everyone stop.
Yeah. Corruptly pay off like the councilman. To just...
That would be the 200th most corrupt event in New Jersey state government history.
Even in Jersey City history
alone, yeah.
Yeah. So you have a book that's out this week. I guess I'm in the process, early in the process of writing a book. Like, what's this kind of sort of psychic effect on you of finally having something published and in the hands of the public after having worked on it for so long?
It's incredibly weird. It's a relief. It's also a fair amount of anticlimax, in part because, I would have hoped there would have been some in-person events. There's none of those. Yeah, it's slightly lonely because you've been working on this thing forever, and then it's out in the world and you no longer have any control over it. And you're just sort of waiting for feedback and sales numbers to come back in. But overall, I just feel incredibly grateful I was given this opportunity. I mean, this allowed me to leave my day job, and as of now, there's no sign I'll have to go back to a day job, which is an incredible luxury. As millionaires like you, as Substack millionaires like
Exactly.
So it's mostly grateful. It is psychologically weird, just because you're just you can't control who writes about it or what they say. But we've been fortunate with the promotion so far, so we'll see.
Yeah. So I do want to get into some of the substance of the book, but it did occur to me that given a lot of the misplaced antagonism that you provoke, that it seemed like there was a possibility that could sort of inhibit your ability to promote the book on your own terms. Whereas people just, I think, might assume that the book is all about some of the stuff that you discuss day to day on the podcast with Katie or in your other writing, campus controversy type issues, gender identity issues, that those sort of realm of that realm of topics. I think the book really isn't about that at all. Maybe there's some kind of ancillary bearing you could extrapolate from the kind of thrust of the book on those subjects. But has that struck you as as a factor you have to sort of navigate in just the logistical promotion of the book?
Yes and no. I mean, it's just hard to know. You can't control who reviews your book. You can't control what they say about it. It is on a totally different subject, and the subset of people who know me from Twitter, I think, probably have a pretty skewed view of me because I don't tweet in perfect proportion to what I'm most interested in. I tweet often in reaction to aspects of mainstream media I can't stand, even though they're like me, very much left of center. So yeah,
I can relate to that.
Yeah, you can relate to that slightly, just a little bit. Tracy the supervillain. Yeah. So look, we've been very lucky. We've set up a lot of podcast interviews. I can promote it on my own podcast. We have a major newspaper adapted essay running Saturday. So I would have to be a big jerk to complain. I will say that when you become capital C controversial, one of the goals of sort of the Twitter pylons and all that is to put doubt in the back of your mind, like, oh, why didn't this outlet cover me, or why did I not book this thing? But like, come on, a million writers every day have to deal with not getting exactly the coverage they want, and I've been incredibly lucky. So I'm trying not to worry about that.
Yeah, I guess the thing that came to mind most to me in that regard is your presence on this GLAD accountability list, which I guess they initially took down uh, when you were first placed on it, and now there's like this revised version up there, and you're on this list alongside like Donald Trump, Fox News personalities as an enemy of LGBTQ rights, apparently.
It's
So
very
that's
weird.
kind of
Yeah,
weird.
it's really weird. I mean, the whole point is to sort of, this stems from mostly from an Atlanta cover story I did about sort of the process of assessing kids with gender dysphoria and when to put them on hormones and puberty blockers. And if you read through this thing, there's some stuff that's inaccurate. There's like situations where they just don't seem to understand the available evidence or what I'm drawing on. I will say at this point, after they took it down because it was pretty obviously defamatory and they had lied, they put it back up where it's now padded with so many random references and so much hedging and caveating that I'm not sure a normie could read it and understand exactly what I'm being accused of. But obviously, it's alarming to be put on a list like that. And I don't know, it speaks to something a little bit messed up in the present moment, because I don't think anyone can fairly read what I've written and come to those conclusions. But it's a sort of crazy era in a lot of ways.
But like you mentioned, it's not even clear what conclusion they're trying to draw, other than that you fit under this umbrella category as somebody who's hostile to LGBTQ rights. Like, and I just before we did this podcast, I reread the GLAD entry, and maybe it's just my implicit bias, um, but the quotes that they present from you are fairly benign. I mean, in other words, you come across better in the entry than the people who actually wrote the entry, at least in my reading of it, which might not be the reading that's most common amongst these kind of foundation slash activist
Well,
circles.
I mean, there's a huge gap between what people on Twitter think, and then I've been getting a lot of heat lately because I for being against these laws that ban youth transition, that ban blockers and hormones. And what people on Twitter don't realize is like I think they're pretty far out of step with public opinion, because I get a lot of notes from people who are clearly liberals but are like, why would you medicalize kids? Why would you put them on blockers and hormones? And in my view, for kids who are going to feel really horrible forever without these treatments, there's a subset of them where you should do those treatments. I just want them to be assessed correctly. And there are some horror stories of kids being put on hormones and blockers too quickly. There are also kids who are cut off from them entirely, so it's complicated. But Twitter is just such a funhouse mirror world where like opinions that on like left Twitter are sort of hegemonic are held by maybe 5% of the American population, and this can help explain why journalism is getting so warped and bad, because journalists spend all day on Twitter.
Yeah. I also think there's another element now where, because you have a new slew of legislative initiatives, mostly in Republican states, to curtail the access that trans kids, you're going to get in trouble, but the whole concept of a trans kid seems like it's somewhat fraught and begets some further interrogation. But just as shorthand, trans kids, they're attempting to limit the access of those kids to certain medical services. And so now, if you can be accused of harboring some sort of transphobia, even if the basis for alleging your purported transphobia is totally groundless, um, I guess the idea is now you're contributing to almost this drive toward what trans activists regard as like extermination, or a really kind of enormously dangerous societal determination to impose massive suffering on them, and so that's why the slightest kind of wrong phrasing of something, or like a willful misconstrual of something that you wrote a few years ago, is now there's like an extra moral urgency in their mind around it, which is probably why now you see these additions to like something like an accountability list. I mean, if what accountability are they even attempting to institute? Like, what does accountability mean? I don't know. They don't seem to define that.
No, I mean, I think it's just trying to hurt people who said stuff they don't like. And I'm sure there are people on the list who I think are genuinely transphobic. And, I'd push back a little. I'm going to cancel you over this. I think there's some kids who are trans kids who, like, some kids from a very young age are just, I think born in the wrong body is often the wrong model, but there's a subset of those of kids where that really applies. And the first generation of sort of puberty blockers and hormones for kids, it was like kids who were well diagnosed in this clinic in Amsterdam. And like, I really think they will basically suffer forever if we can't give them this treatment. And there's some evidence in that context, not great evidence, but evidence. There's less evidence for situations where like kids have multiple other mental health comorbidities, or they seem to have determined very quickly out of nowhere they might be trans. My only argument is that in situations like this, you would want to carefully assess kids the same way you would carefully assess them, ideally, before even putting them on Ritalin or an antidepressant or other medications that are a lot less serious than puberty blockers or hormones. And what I just described to you has been described as a trans eliminationist perspective. Trans eliminationist. I don't It
Like
doesn't
genocide?
matter. Genocidal. It doesn't matter how many people yell at me on Twitter. It does not change the words I actually wrote, nor does it change my belief that these bills are bad, nor does it change my belief that on balance, I would want a trans kid to have access to these hormones and blockers if competent adults determine them to be the best choice. I think there's this belief among people who spend all day on Twitter that if you repeat the same lie long enough, it becomes true. And I mean, they're right because it does become true, but I'm not going to go along with that ever.
Yeah, and just to break myself out of cancellation jail, I wasn't asserting that trans kids quote don't exist.
You son of a bitch.
I just noticed that there seems to be a flippancy on the part of a lot of people who are newfound adherents to the kind of framework that's operative here in just applying that designation to any kid that they may vaguely associate as meeting certain often vague criteria.
Well, that's what's interesting about this is like, so there
just as an example, I mean, on Trans Visibility Day last week, there was a thread that went enormously viral. Journalists were praising it to the hilt. All kinds of blue checks were, showering it in adulation, and it was this, podcast host in L.A. who was saying that his kindergartner was a trans kid. I mean, the kindergartner was no longer, or in other words, the kid started identifying as trans when the kid was kindergarten age. The kid's now a little bit older, and like there was not even any question raised as to whether that's like a methodologically valid label to affix to a kindergartner. And so that's why I have a little bit of hesitation when I just hear that term bandied about without any kind of accompanying kind of rigor behind it.
Yeah, what I've heard from clinicians is that there is this thing sometimes where like your little boy acts in a girly way and parents are uncomfortable with that, and they're almost more comfortable if their kid is just a girl than a really effeminate boy. I do think parents sometimes prefer these like really constrictive categories, so it's this weird horseshoe theory thing where you almost have liberal parents looking at the gender boxes in just as restrictive way as conservative ones. But this is all just to say that I wish there was a better crop of like actual experts in gender clinics who could just talk to kids and let them explain what they're going through. This is not, it shouldn't be that fraught to say that before you put a kid on puberty blockers, you should just make sure they meet the DSM criteria for gender dysphoria. That, like, if we can't agree on that you should meet the criteria for the serious medication you're putting a kid who cannot legally consent to medical treatment on, I don't know where we are, but you see, you will experience what seems to be intense pushback to that. I'm curious what would happen if you then got one of these guys saying that on a podcast and you force them to defend that opinion. But it's weird, man. They seem to be very much against any of the sort of like differential diagnosis you'd want with any condition. I don't get it.
Yeah, and this is just one Twitter thread that happened to be circulated on that one day, but this person was claiming that his child began to socially transition in kindergarten, and what I was averse to in reading that was the notion that a kindergartner has the capacity to make these fully autonomous decisions that are being ascribed to them by adults, and by adults who have a particular set of political and cultural values that interrelate with trans quote unquote ideology or gender identity ideology. So it seemed like celebrating that as some kind of fulfillment of the child's true nature, as opposed to a set of conditions that the adults knowingly place the child, the result of a set of conditions that the adults knowingly place the child in. That's what I find off-putting.
Yeah, I just think you got to let kids be themselves and understand they have limited understandings of gender. That ever since I first wrote about this in 2016, it's like you can just sit a kid in a psychologist's office and be like, "Hey, what's going on with you? What's your sense of why you're a boy, why you're a girl?" And you're not going to push back or not accept their answers, but the answers they give you are telling. I had a friend whose daughter, at a very young age, got confused and thought that if she'd be a boy, she'd have shorter hair, she'd run faster on the soccer field. So you just want to make sure that what's going on is a little bit more deep-seated than that, I would say, before doing, even a full-blown social transition. I don't think there's any downside to letting kids dress and play and act however they want. But, when it comes to kids and the possibility of kids being harmed, people have understandably strong feelings.
I agree. So let's transition, quote unquote, into the book, which I do recommend people read. One thing that I think sums up a core theme of the book is a quote here that I'll just read from briefly, which you say, "As an idea without firm basis and clear conceptual boundaries gains more and more purchase in the public imagination, there's less and less rhetorical precision in how it's used." And in a way, that could relate even to the trans kids issue that we just touched on. Not trying to get you to go down that road necessarily, but I think after you see that happening over and over again in so many different domains, you begin to wonder, like, what is the precise genesis for that kind of concept creep, or this kind of diffusion of an idea to the point where it's sort of unrecognizable from the initial idea. And you sort of recount that, like, the initial impetus for the book was you working in the field of science journalism and constantly getting these, publicity emails, which journalists are always inundated with, where it's like, oh, the one weird trick that will solve some kind of complex social malady. We have the new study that has all the inside info. And I, as I was reading the book, I kept coming back to the culprit for a lot of this. Yes, there's a lot of lazy science and lazy communication of science by the scientists themselves, or advocates who are kind of leveraging scientific knowledge to generate income or status for themselves. But a lot of it seems like it does come down to the media, in that we're reacting when bad scientific ideas percolate. They percolate through media channels mainly. I mean, people are not sitting down and reading scientific journals for the most part. And yet it didn't seem like the question of the media's relationship to this stuff, meaning the kind of the bad ideas of pop psychology that have proliferated. You touch on that here and there, but you don't really give any kind of stirring. You don't give as stirring of an indictment as the media as I might be inclined to for their complicity in that. Is that a fair reading?
Yeah, I think I'm sympathetic. I was just on another podcast where people, very bad wizards, where I was told I was too sympathetic to one of the sort of arguable scientific bad actors in the book. I think when it comes to journalists, the reason I'm somewhat sympathetic is like we're just overwhelmed and journalism is collapsing. And I've been that guy who had to produce multiple stories a day. I don't think it's good. Hey, can you hear the? We'll edit this out, but can you hear the siren in the background?
No, I can't.
Okay, good.
We can just leave that in because people find these snafus sort of funny. So
it's incredibly charming and endearing. We're just two normal.
It's real. It's authentic. Yeah, we're just two guys.
Two blue collar podcasters in the content mines. I didn't have it in my heart to blame journalists that much. I mean, throughout the book, I do mention how credulous journalism helps these ideas to spread, but there's so little scientific training among journalists, and there's so much pressure to just produce content that I can understand how they get hoodwinked by like an excited seeming press release from the University of Pennsylvania or Harvard. I wish they would do better.
By the way, what's up with the University of Pennsylvania? I mean, that particular university came up over and over again as a source of some of these bad ideas that went bizarrely unquestioned for like years.
Yeah, some of this comes down to the positive psychology guru and sort of co-founder Marty Seligman, and then one of his students, Angela Duckworth, who is like a widely celebrated social psychologist. I do criticize her. Like, I don't think she's been particularly dishonest, but you know, she came up with a concept called grid, and I think she sort of stretched the evidence for it. So a lot of these guys are guilty of that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess maybe if you had it in you, there is maybe a more structural critique of the journalism or media industry that might have been on offer.
Yeah, well, I make that a little bit.
I just a little bit too far flung from the core thesis of the book.
Yeah, and I think from reading it, it'll be clear that if we were 30 years ago and there were a lot of journalists who well, still having to hustle and work hard, had the luxury of like writing, 2 or 3 newspaper articles a week instead of multiple articles a day, I do think the science coverage situation would be a little bit better. Then again, I'm sure if I went back to the 1980s, I would see a lot of bad science writing there. So who knows?
Well, there was some, and you cited some overly credulous reporting, for example, on the self-esteem movement.
Yeah, that's true.
Began in I think it was the late 80s, right? And obviously you don't present the full breadth of coverage of this self-esteem movement that was burgeoning at the time, and you got to assume that there was some there was some skeptical renderings of its potential, of its claimed efficacy, right, in the popular press. But at the same time, it was true that a lot of the supposed findings that found a vast value in the institution of these self-esteem programs in schools and other institutions, it was just kind of passed along to the public in quasi press release type form. And it seems like a big reason why it gained the traction that it did.
Yeah, and I think part of that is just like everyday beat reporters who aren't science reporters per se, when they encounter scientific claims that authority experts are providing them, they're just going to be stenographers. They don't have the tools to really skeptically analyze those claims, and that's a big part of the problem. So it's not just people on like the dedicated science beat. It's culture reporters who get pulled into reporting on science, or political reporters. It's everything.
Yeah. So there's another quote that I'm going to just read here from that self-esteem chapter, which I think is really instructive because it relates to how these ideas become so intractable, and how an industry sort of forms around them that militates against ever recognizing their invalidity on the part of the proponents, because they have so much professionally and socially invested in these ideas. So the quote is here: the cottage industrialization of self-esteem might have further disincentivized many people, including the school district and corporate decision makers who had already shelled out money for them, from viewing the concept with too skeptical of an eye. And I think that's sort of like a simple point in its way, that if there's if you have like a fiduciary interest in a certain idea's mass acceptance, and that's going to disincline you to applying the proper rigor to an evaluation of it, because that could then limit your financial opportunities.
Yeah, well, and you can make the same argument about social incentives. If you have a social or professional incentive that's not directly monetary, in saying you believe in something, you will say you believe in that thing.
Yeah, and I think the self-esteem stuff is interesting because I hadn't really thought about that ever in much depth. But then you kind of talk about your own childhood, and there were these self-esteem exercises where people like passing around a koosh ball, and kids were told to compliment each other and tell their classmates that they were good at something, like you can kick a soccer ball far. I don't know that I have specific memories of that, but I do remember this kind of ethos of self-esteem infusing a lot of my early childhood education. I hadn't really thought about it before I read that chapter. A lot of the kind of the most obvious examples of that are just those cheesy posters that would be hung in the library, where it's like, a girl looking out on a sun-drenched field and saying, you can do it, and the caption is like, you can do anything that you set your mind to, or something.
Yeah.
And yeah, it just I hadn't really tied that to like a specific policy initiative that had a lot of resources behind it.
Yeah, I find that satisfying when you can like take some. You can't always do this, but often you can take some like cultural fad or craze and like sometimes trace it back to like specific rooms where specific decisions are made, and I find that process pretty fascinating.
Yeah. So yeah, on this issue of self-esteem, and I think one thing you do a good job in the book is like you always acknowledge that there's a kernel of truth to a lot of these fads, and critically evaluating the methodology that's been employed to kind of promote them as like monocausal solutions to complex problems doesn't undermine the idea that like it's probably prudent to give kids a positive reinforce kids having a positive view of themselves, as opposed to a negative view. And so like I have a hard time really like condemning the people who are invested in this idea of like the promotion of self-esteem, because who could be against a child self-esteem being fostered? The problem always comes when it turns into this cottage industry, where you have like hordes of consultants attempting to monetize the fad, and claims being made about certain techniques that go far beyond what those techniques can be proven to actually accomplish in the real world.
Yeah. I mean, look, if this was just like helping kids not feel horrible about themselves or helping people with horribly low self-esteem feel better, there'd be no gripe. The problem is always these much grander claims that catch on and become sort of like get recited like a mantra, which happens throughout my book with different ideas.
You even go so far as to say like a fictionalized version of this narrative of self-esteem being this kind of all-powerful solution to the woes of America's children. That's the narrative that ended up winning out. Bill Clinton endorsed the project, as you mentioned. Barbara Bush, Colin Powell, and yeah, I mean, it does. Once you're able to look back on this kind of self-esteem craze through a more critical lens, I think it just necessitates that you look at current crazes with the same lens, which is why I think the book is sort of helpful. I mean, have you heard from people? Have you heard like variations of that from people where they'll tell you, "Oh yeah, I mean, I hadn't even really given much thought to something like self-esteem even being a craze, but now I'm gonna try to adjust my interpretive framework for other potential crazes that are swirling around now that might benefit from a little more scrutiny."
Yeah, I mean, well, I've heard that more actually with the implicit association test. That's this test that supposedly reveals your unconscious bias. People just took it at face value and assumed it was true, assumed it was scientific. But it's the same as self-esteem in the sense that like you're making a lot of assumptions about the underlying evidence, and it's much more a fad for cultural reasons or sort of corporate reasons than because of the strength of the evidence.
Yeah. On that implicit bias test, um, one thing that occurred to me is that I think you pretty convincingly lay out why the implicit bias test does not have not have an ample evidentiary basis to believe that it's really effective at all, despite the kind of fictionalized narrative that was crafted around it. But the reason why it seems to be so popular is because it's very much conducive to the construction of these cottage industries. There's consultants and books and people giving well-paid speaking engagements and so forth. But on the racial question in particular, it seems like there could be an equally a large cottage industry now for people who are more inclined to focus on structural inequities. Like it seems like that's almost become, I don't know if it's a fad unto itself, but that the popularity of that understanding of racial inequality is now popular enough or now widespread enough that you could easily see it morphing into these kind of cottage industrialization versions.
What's weird to me about people who don't see the problem with a lot of this stuff, from the IIT to Robin DiAngelo to even some like microaggressions trainings, when you say that, people say, "Oh, you're some right winger, you're some reactionary." There's very good reasons to be against these programs, or at least skeptical of them. And I think the role of capitalism, ironically, gets left out by a lot of people on the left who aren't skeptical of these ideas. But there's a reason these ideas are structured in the way they are. There's a reason they focus on individuals. There's a reason they offload responsibility onto individual workers and students. And there's a reason none of them have anything to do with the structural reasons we might encounter racial discrepancies in the first place. So I think there's a certain level of usually unintentional, but sometimes intentional scamming going on here. And that's why my chapter on this stuff isn't just about the IIT, but about this broader trajectory in American race talk and race training.
There's also a reason why corporations are happy to indulge in these trainings, right? I mean, they don't threaten the corporation self-interest at all. And there's you even see many corporate figures arguing that they enhance their self-interest by, cultivating a more inclusive workforce or what have you. So, I mean, it's totally aligned with their kind of capitalist incentives.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not the first one to point this out, but it should cause you to ask some questions about your own politics and your own radicalism when they're completely compatible with everything major corporations are saying. I think you've made that point before too.
I have, and people get really angry when you point that out. Like when you wonder why, when the protest movement erupted last summer, that it was immediate for all, virtually, of corporate America, for all the power centers of American society to embrace it and adopt at least its kind of branding components. Like, would they have done so if they felt like existentially threatened by the demands being leveled? And
Right.
of course, like it's impossible in a mass protest movement to reduce the quote demands like one specific list, but there were a few key themes there, and yet if you point that out, it seems like you're inevitably accused of like discounting the entire movement or insulting every individual participant, and that was never really my intention. My intention was to kind of take a broader view at how it could have been the case that a movement that seemed to at least posture as emanating this kind of radicalism was so easily incorporated into these mainstream power centers. Like, isn't that an interesting question to ponder? Apparently not for some people.
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah. So another interesting part of the book was the chapter on like positive psychology, and particularly what interested me was how the military ended up spending up like millions of dollars on implementing these like positive psychology trainings or workshops or whatever to address the the epidemic of PTSD amongst soldiers returning home from Afghanistan and Iraq. So can you just explain what happened there?
Yeah, this is maybe the craziest chapter in my book, and the one I'm sort of most excited to have out in the world. The short version is in the late aughts, the Army recognized a lot of soldiers were coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan deeply traumatized and weren't getting the help they needed. And they turned to Martin Seligman, who's one of the co-founders of, there's some fuzziness there, but basically one of the founders of positive psychology. He started a positive psychology center at the University of Pennsylvania that gives out degrees in applied positive psychology. And he convinced the military that he could take this pre-existing program called the Penn Resilience Program and adapt it to the military. The problem was this was a program for 10 to 14-year-olds to reduce their anxiety and depression symptoms. So right off the bat, there's that problem of like, how can you take a program for 10 to 14-year-olds in normal school settings and then apply it to 20-year-olds in like horrific warfare settings? There's also the problem that preventing PTSD and depression, which we don't have great evidence we can even do it that much, that's different from preventing PTSD and suicide. Obviously, PTSD and suicide and anxiety and depression all go together, but they're all different things that you need to treat differently. So, as my reporting found, based in part on the few people who have looked into this, the Army has probably spent something like $500 million on this program for which there was never any evidence, and no evidence has ever come out that it works. And I think, as my own podcast co-host said, like, maybe don't send people to war if you're going to traumatize. Maybe that's the best bet, which of course, but if you are going to send people to war, maybe don't spend hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars on programs that don't do anything. It's just a pretty outrageous story of science gone wrong.
And did you look into the firsthand accounts that soldiers or whomever who underwent these training programs? How do they feel about it? I mean, do they? Although this wouldn't be the most methodologically sound way to evaluate the efficacy, but do they self-report having gained benefit from it? Because it seems like it could just be one of these annoying administrative loophole, hoops you have to jump through to satisfy a certain like requirement. Because the program was mandated, meaning right. So soldiers were required to undergo one of these positive psychology type trainings. Was it annually? Is there any reason to believe, maybe even just anecdotally, that they found some usefulness in it? Because I would doubt that they would.
Yeah, so I actually did a newsletter on this. I did not, and I quoted soldiers about having PTSD or veterans. I did not really look into that question of how individual soldiers felt about it, because it honestly doesn't really matter. What matters empirically is what effect it has on them, and people can't always self-reflect on their experiences and be like, this worked, this didn't work. There was one anthropologist, I think her name was Emily Sohn, who looked into how this was administered day to day, and she found evidence of what I think you would expect, which is soldiers just viewed this as another task and did not take it seriously and just checked the box, and the program was unable to generate good data in part as a result of this. So soldiers did, based on what she found, this one academic, soldiers did not take it seriously.
Yeah, like I can just imagine, if I was required to do that, even if I felt like I maybe had an ailment that needed to be addressed, if it was this kind of imposition upon me, I would just kind of instinctively react negatively or exasperatedly to it. And not that self-reporting is the be-all end-all. Obviously, it's not. But I am now curious, after having read that chapter, to see if there's any kind of data, as limited as it might be, in terms of its ultimate implications, just how they individually view themselves as having experienced it. Because if it's just another kind of box you have to check in order to be in good standing and not be disciplined by the military, then I don't know, at least it seems like it's worth taking into account.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It basically comes down to you need to have a way to produce good outcome data, and the Army, for reasons I explained in the chapter, couldn't even set up a proper way of generating data that could tell them if it worked. So it was just bungled in certain basic scientific ways from the start.
Yeah, another thing I was sort of curious about journalistically in terms of your method for doing the book is that it seems like you kind of did the reported elements of it over the course of a couple years, and the people like this guy Seligman, who you would reach out to for comment or clarification on certain things. It seemed they're mostly pretty evasive or reluctant to provide you with substantiating evidence for some of their core premises. And that's the opposite of what you would expect for like a science entrepreneur or something who's secure in their notions of the legitimacy of what they're advocating, right? So, I mean, did you find that was there kind of this recurrent evasiveness? I know there was one exception that you mentioned, the woman whose name escapes me, but was it kind of difficult to pin these people down and get them to answer kind of direct questions in the main?
Yeah, I mean, it varied. Seligman sort of would point me to research. He'd point me to a list of studies he'd published showing positive psychology to be successful, or the Penn Resilience Program. But that's not really how science works. You can't just let someone who designed a program cherry pick studies. You're supposed to do what's called a meta-analysis, where you find all the studies you can, average out the effects, and by that standard, the Penn Resilience Program wasn't impressive. So one of the points I make is that, like, I think it's a big moment character-wise and ethics-wise when you're a scientist and one of your ideas comes under legitimate threat, and the decision you make there can sort of define your legacy. And scientists vary a great deal in how well they handle that. Some just double and triple and quadruple down. Others are open to input, at least, and to revising their claims a little bit.
Yeah. So I guess if I had to distill the main argument of the book, it's that these quote unquote quick fixes that originate in pop psychology that then gets transmitted to the public through imperfect means, they tend to be kind of a workaround for addressing structural issues, and that sort of explains why they're so eagerly embraced by institutions who do not stand to benefit from wide scale structural reforms. Like even some of going back to the self-esteem thing. I mean, maybe one way to cultivate self-esteem in a child is to provide them with adequate educational resources so that they have a stable upbringing.
Nope, too hard.
Yeah, so like they're not, like you mentioned at one point that the kind of depressing reality is that for very young children from like 0 to 5, if they are in a stressful environment where they're constantly having stressors impinging upon them, that's going to have potentially lifelong consequences that any self-esteem pamphlet is never going to be able to remediate. Is that sort of like the basic takeaway that I should be coming away with?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a conspiracy, but I think it shouldn't surprise us that if you work in an office and you want to show you're committed to diversity, you're not going to have the time or the inclination to like really dig into the problem of like why your office is disproportionately white, if that's the case. What you can do is grab off the shelf a nifty implicit association test training or microaggressions training and just sort of assume that doing that will fix things. And because it's so rare that people like carefully measure outcomes, you really can just tick that off your box of to-do items. So I think there's a lot of that going on here.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, that I think that's everything I more or less wanted to cover. I mean, obviously there's a lot more in the book that people should read and purchase. I'll have the link to do so in the Substack post here and wherever else this audio conversation is published. Is there anything that springs to mind for you that maybe we omitted?
No, I mean, I would just say like if you're worried about the stuff we talked about at the beginning about mainstream media becoming more homogenous and less welcoming of sort of nudges and stuff, and the book sounds at all intriguing to you, please consider buying it because those sales numbers make a very big difference. But there's also tons of interviews and stuff I've done with people where you can learn more if you'd prefer to just do that.
One last thing. that I did have a note on but overlooked. As I was reading the chapter on positive psychology, and particularly the military chapter, in the whole reason why there was this push to address post-traumatic stress is because obviously soldiers were going home from Afghanistan. They were dealing with this enduring trauma from really horrific experiences. And when I think about this issue of the popularization problem, I think is what it's referred to. With this increasing awareness around PTSD, a legitimately debilitating malady that people have, it seems like, and just my maybe in my admittedly sort of limited, from my admittedly limited standpoint, it seems like this concept of trauma is now being applied to like a whole vast array of different domains. And it's ironically because it seems to stem in large part, at least from this growing awareness of PTSD, which is much more narrowly related to people undergoing truly traumatic experiences where they were in extreme physical danger, or they witnessed like the killing of a fellow soldier, what have you. But now trauma is so dominant in like mainstream parlance that it gets shunted into all manner of even just like matters of disagreement sometimes, or matters of slight but overcomable misfortune or adversity. And I'm just wondering if that has ever occurred to you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I just did an article for Reason about how this professor was investigated because she disagreed with a white fragility training, and there was a lot of trauma language justifying the investigation. People will say they've been harmed and traumatized when they're expressed to political opinions you can see every night on Fox News or every moment of the day on AM radio. So I also wrote an article about this for 1843 The Economist magazine that maybe you could link to, but there's two things going on at once. One is that there's been a much needed recognition of genuine trauma and genuine PTSD and how to treat them. There has been this weird harm inflation thing where more and more people seem to think they can get some cachet from saying they've been traumatized. And I'm not sure that's that healthy an attitude. I mean, even just the way it might cause people to take genuine trauma claims less seriously. But I've definitely noticed that, and it definitely worries me a little bit.
Yeah, and you even see, I mean, I've written about this recently. We even see, professional adult journalists in major publications doing so in order to achieve various goals that they have. And that strikes me as the tipping point where we need to kind of more critically assess the functionality of this new kind of trauma jargon. But that's my hobby horse, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, Jesse. Well, thanks for taking out some time to do this, and good luck on the rest of the book. I guess it's not a tour, but a
virtual tour,
which
is
kind of I wouldn't say depressing, maybe.
No, it is a little bit depressing.
Oh,
but
okay.
On the list of COVID related problems, not being able to promote my book in person is pretty low. So it is what it is.
Yeah, I wouldn't do a Substack post with 2,000 words devoted to complaining about that.
I'm gonna do a tweet storm about how unfair it is, how I can't infect people with COVID to promote my book. But thank you for having me on, and thanks, man.
All right, take care.
Bye.